Sarah stepped into the grand Southampton estate on the 23rd of March, with a worn cloth bag resting on her shoulder, and a contract signed just the day before. She had no idea that this sprawling stone mansion harbored a silence utterly unlike any other. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to spill down the sweeping marble corridors and crawl up the soaring gold-leafed ceilings, feeling as though it had been mixed right into the original foundation. She was 32 years old, burdened by rent that was exactly 1 month overdue, and possessed the absolute certainty that she needed this specific job more than anything else in the world right now. The local staffing agency had been incredibly direct about the expectations for this particular assignment. The sprawling oceanfront estate demanded absolute discretion, flawless punctuality, and absolutely zero unnecessary contact with the wealthy owner of the property. Sarah had agreed to every single condition without a moment of hesitation, because when the monthly bills tighten their grip, strict conditions cease to be a problem and simply become minor details. The house was remarkably enormous, boasting 3 massive floors, 8 sprawling bedrooms, a gourmet kitchen that rivaled any high-end restaurant, and a main hall with ceilings so high that a mere whisper would echo into the void. Sarah arrived exceptionally early, long before 7 o'clock in the morning, where the head housekeeper Nancy received her at the service entrance. Nancy stood with a crisply printed list of chores in her hand and a stern, unwavering gaze that immediately communicated there would be no room for idle chatter in this household. She instructed Sarah to begin on the 3rd floor, work her way down the east wing, and finish the grand hall entirely before noon. While an elderly gardener named Mr. Harrison offered Sarah a brief sympathetic nod from the doorway, Nancy explicitly commanded her never to open closed doors, never to answer ringing telephones, and never to ask any questions that did not directly pertain to her cleaning duties. Sarah quietly folded the printed list, tucked it safely into the deep pocket of her apron, and immediately set off to begin her work without a single complaint. The 3rd floor possessed a distinctly different atmosphere from the rest of the grand house. It felt closed off and stagnant, as though the space had not been genuinely lived in for a very long time. As she dragged her damp mop across the polished hardwood corridor, she could not help but notice that every single door remained firmly shut, except for the very last one on the left. A terribly weak sliver of light spilled from that slightly ajar door, accompanied by an absolute unbroken silence. She continued her duties diligently, moving past the cracked door, without so much as a lingering glance, fully respecting Nancy's extremely clear warnings about maintaining boundaries. She descended to the 2nd floor, thoroughly scrubbed 2 luxurious guest bathrooms, meticulously polished the grand mahogany banister, and finally reached the cavernous main hall, closer to 10:30 in the morning. Her hands were already stinging and turning a harsh red from the strong cleaning chemicals, while her mind anxiously calculated if she would have enough time to pick up her 8-year-old daughter Alice from school before 5 o'clock in the evening. It was exactly in that moment, kneeling awkwardly on the freezing marble floor and vigorously rubbing a soft flannel cloth against the ornate baseboards, that she heard it for the very first time. It was a remarkably low, trembling whimper, almost entirely imperceptible to the ear, drifting down from somewhere hidden in the shadows above the grand, sweeping staircase. Sarah froze completely, holding her breath to listen, as the fragile crying persisted for perhaps 3 slow seconds before dissolving back into the oppressive silence. She slowly lifted her head, staring up at the distant ceiling, as if she might somehow see straight through the thick plaster before forcing herself to return to the baseboards, because she knew it was not her problem. Nancy suddenly appeared just as the grand-grandfather clock chimed noon, wearing the exact same severe expression she had worn that morning to inspect the completed work. She briskly informed Sarah that the level of cleanliness was perfectly within their high expectations, and instructed her to return for another shift on Tuesday. Sarah gracefully accepted her daily wages in cash, offered a polite but restrained word of thanks, and promptly walked out the back door without uttering a single question about the house. However, as the chilly coastal wind battered her face on the long walk to the bus stop, the phantom sound of that quiet, desperate crying simply refused to leave her troubled mind. On Tuesday, she faithfully returned to the estate, and she did exactly the same on Thursday, slowly familiarizing herself with the intricate rhythms of the wealthy household. Within the span of 2 short weeks, Sarah instinctively knew every hidden corner of that massive Hamptons property, including exactly which floorboards groaned underfoot. She learned that a specific heavy window in the east corridor would stubbornly swing open on its own whenever the fierce ocean breeze battered the glass. Most importantly, she discovered that the final room with the cracked door on the 3rd floor belonged to the young daughter of the house, a little girl named Brooke. She had learned the child's name entirely by accident, while quietly polishing a silver mirror, inadvertently overhearing Nancy speaking in harsh, hushed tones on the telephone. The housekeeper was sternly explaining to someone on the other end of the line that the child had completely refused to touch her dinner yet again, and that a private medical doctor needed to be summoned before the week concluded. Sarah kept her head down, vigorously pretending she had not heard a single syllable of the private conversation, and simply continued sweeping the long hallway without asking for any clarifications. From that revealing moment onward, however, she began paying much closer attention to the subtle movements within the cold, echoing mansion. The little girl looked to be about 5 years old, perhaps, turning 6, with an incredibly pale complexion and large, sorrowful eyes that seemed far too old for her tiny face. On the rare, fleeting days when Sarah accidentally crossed paths with her in the cavernous hallways, the quiet child would immediately avert her gaze and refuse to utter a single syllable. Sarah could plainly see that this profound behavior was not mere childish shyness, but rather the heavy, heartbreaking silence of a young soul who had tragically learned that speaking her mind would not change her reality. Thomas, the millionaire father of the household, was a towering figure Sarah had only glimpsed a handful of times since her employment began. Thomas always wore flawlessly tailored expensive suits, and he constantly paced the halls with a glowing mobile phone pressed to his ear, or a business associate trailing behind him, loudly debating profit margins and corporate mergers. Whenever his brisk strides carried him past Sarah in the narrow corridors, his eyes remained firmly fixed straight ahead, utterly ignoring her existence as if she were simply an invisible piece of the decorative wallpaper. Sarah genuinely did not mind this blatant dismissal. Life had taught her long ago that exceptionally wealthy men rarely notice the invisible hands that scrub their floors. She also knew that his glaring lack of basic acknowledgement spoke volumes about his own character, rather than reflecting anything negative about her own inherent worth. What Sarah absolutely did not anticipate happened on a particularly dreary, rain-soaked Thursday morning, while she was diligently scrubbing the baseboards of the 3rd-floor corridor on her aching knees. The heavy wooden door to Brooke's bedroom slowly creaked open, and the tiny girl appeared in the narrow threshold, clutching a worn rag doll by its arm, her eyes rimmed with angry red puffiness. Sarah paused, her scrubbing her soapy sponge hovering mid-air, while Brooke stood frozen in the doorway, creating a stretched, fragile moment that felt significantly longer than it actually was. Gently, without making any sudden movements, or showing a trace of false pity, Sarah softly whispered into the quiet space, asking the child if she was all right. The little girl offered no verbal response to the gentle inquiry, but crucially, she did not retreat, and violently slammed the heavy bedroom door shut either. She simply remained anchored in the doorway, staring intently at the kneeling maid with a remarkably bewildered expression, as if she had absolutely no idea how to handle genuine unforced attention from an adult. Sarah wisely chose not to push the delicate boundary. She simply lowered her sponge back into the warm, soapy water and resumed her meticulous scrubbing. However, she deliberately left the comfortable silence stretching gently between them, projecting an aura of immense patience that completely lacked any pressure for the child to speak. A couple of minutes later, Brooke timidly shuffled forward and quietly seated herself on the cold hallway floor, leaning her small back against the expensive wallpaper while tightly hugging her beloved doll. She stayed there, a silent sentinel watching the rhythmic motions of the cleaning cloth, while Sarah diligently finished scrubbing that specific section of the long corridor. No words were exchanged between them during those peaceful minutes, simply because no words were necessary to establish the quiet bond forming in the shadows. By the time Sarah finally stood up and carried her heavy bucket toward the grand staircase, Brooke had silently slipped back into her bedroom, leaving Sarah with a strange, heavy warmth blooming unexpectedly in her chest. During the following week, an identical scenario played out in the hallway, but this time the little girl bravely chose to sit noticeably closer to the working maid. Brooke settled herself a mere 2 meters away from Sarah's bucket, intently observing the precise soapy circles being drawn on the floorboards before her tiny voice broke the silence. With a tone so fragile and low that Sarah barely caught the words, the child asked the maid if she knew how to properly braid hair. Sarah paused her work, looking up to find the girl staring with that direct, unadorned seriousness unique to children who have suddenly decided to take a massive leap of faith. Sarah met the child's serious gaze with equal sincerity and replied in a matching gentle tone that she certainly knew how to weave a proper braid. She casually mentioned that her own daughter possessed incredibly long hair, just like the tangled locks currently spilling over Brooke's small, hunched shoulders. Brooke immediately looked down at her own messy, unkempt hair with a profound sense of sadness, her little fingers nervously picking at the fabric of her expensive dress. She quietly confessed to the marble floor that Nancy did not know how to braid properly, complaining that the strict housekeeper always pulled the strands far too tightly, causing her head to ache terribly. Sarah simply nodded in understanding, securely tucking that vital piece of information into her heart, and purposefully remained quiet, keenly aware that pressing for more details would cause the little girl to shut down completely. 3 days later, on a remarkably bright Friday morning, Brooke suddenly materialized in the hallway, holding a colorful elastic band, stopping directly in front of the kneeling maid, without uttering a single word. She simply extended her small hand, offering the bright hair tie with wide, hopeful eyes that silently begged for the gentle touch she had been promised earlier that week. Sarah immediately abandoned her cleaning cloth, wiped her damp hands on her worn apron, and softly instructed the little girl to turn around and sit comfortably on the floor right in front of her. Brooke obediently folded her legs and sat down while Sarah began to separate the tangled strands, with deliberate slowness, moving her fingers with incredible caution to ensure absolutely no pain was inflicted. As she skillfully wove the golden hair together, Sarah murmured in a soothing, low voice, explaining that beautiful hair requires a great deal of patience, and that a good, proper braid should never hurt. Brooke remained perfectly still throughout the entire process, but beneath her skilled fingertips, Sarah could physically feel the heavy, unnatural tension slowly melting away from the young child's rigid shoulders. When the neat braid was finally secured, and Brooke tentatively reached up to touch the woven hair, the beginnings of something profoundly soft and unnamed flickered across her normally stoic face. Thomas happened to witness the entire quiet exchange from the far end of the long hallway, standing completely frozen with his glowing phone forgotten in his hand. He watched the tender scene unfold without announcing his presence or making a single sound, struggling deeply to comprehend the sudden sharp ache blooming fiercely in his own chest. It was a strange, forgotten feeling that he had not allowed himself to experience in a very long time, standing in stark contrast to his usual cold corporate mindset. When Brooke finally stood up and peacefully retreated to her bedroom, Thomas silently turned on his heel and walked away, ensuring Sarah remained entirely unaware of his secret observation. In the days that followed that quiet morning, Thomas unexpectedly began materializing in various parts of the massive estate where he previously had absolutely no reason to be. His sudden appearances were never overly obvious, nor could they easily be labeled as intentional if anyone dared to question his motives, yet the shifting pattern was undeniable. He would inexplicably linger on the luxurious second-floor landing precisely when Sarah was actively dusting the grand foyer below, or he would casually review documents in the spacious kitchen while she mopped the adjacent hallways. Nancy, the eagle-eyed housekeeper, noticed this subtle behavioral shift long before anyone else but she wisely kept her mouth firmly shut, having learned over 20 years that unspoken observations do not breed complicated problems. Sarah, however, did not immediately register his lingering presence. Her exhausted mind was constantly occupied by entirely different, far more pressing matters of survival. She was intensely stressed about her cramped apartment's rent, which remained dangerously overdue, and she worried incessantly about her daughter Alice, who had recently twisted her ankle during recess and desperately needed a medical consultation. She was also frustrated by the unreliable city bus that consistently ran late every single morning, constantly threatening her strict arrival time and her essential daily wages. But on a quiet Wednesday, while she was methodically washing the morning dishes, Thomas strolled into the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water, and she finally felt the weight of his attention. Sarah said absolutely nothing swiftly, retrieving a clean crystal glass from the upper cabinet, filling it with filtered water, placing it gently on the marble counter, and immediately returning to her soapy sink. He lingered by the island for several moments longer than necessary, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the cool glass before softly breaking the dense silence between them. He quietly informed her that Brooke had actually mentioned her name during their formal dinner the previous evening, causing Sarah to completely freeze and stare blankly at the running water. She slowly turned off the brass faucet, dried her hands, and cautiously asked him what his daughter could have possibly said about the cleaning woman. He looked directly into her eyes and replied that his daughter claimed Sarah knew exactly how to braid hair without causing any pain whatsoever. There was an undeniably heavy undercurrent in the way he delivered those simple words. Both of them implicitly understood that this conversation was absolutely not about hair, yet neither was prepared to name the deeper truth. Sarah maintained her professional composure, softly replying that it was simply a matter of paying attention and exercising basic care when handling someone else. He nodded slowly, receiving her humble words as if she had just successfully answered a vastly more important question, and quietly exited the kitchen, leaving Sarah staring thoughtfully at the empty doorway. Throughout the incredibly busy week that followed, the little girl began appearing on the lower floor much more frequently on the specific days when Sarah was scheduled to clean the grand reception areas. Brooke would casually sit on the bottom step of the sweeping staircase, tracing invisible patterns on the marble floor with her tiny finger while watching the maid work diligently nearby. Occasionally, the child would pipe up to ask trivial, seemingly unimportant questions about the bright blue color of the cleaning solution, or why the yellow dusting cloth had funny fringes on its edges. Sarah answered every single inquiry with the exact same warm, effortless naturalness she would use when speaking to her own curious daughter back home in their small apartment. It was precisely through this gentle, pressure-free exchange of mundane details that Brooke gradually began to open the heavy doors guarding her wounded little heart. One mild afternoon, she casually confessed that she intensely disliked her massive bedroom because it felt far too big, claiming it became terribly noisy at night, even when there was absolutely no sound at all. On another remarkably quiet morning, she bluntly stated that her mother had packed her bags and left them exactly 2 years ago, and that her father absolutely hated speaking about the painful departure. Sarah never pushed the child to elaborate on these heavy topics, choosing instead to let the girl offer her fragmented memories entirely on her own terms. Whenever Brooke chose to speak about her absent mother, Sarah always stopped her work to listen with absolute undivided attention, completely stripping any trace of pity from her facial expressions. She knew from hard experience that sensitive children can instantly detect the vast difference between an adult who is genuinely listening and one who is merely humoring them out of a sense of obligation. Thomas secretly learned about every single one of these profound conversations because his daughter excitedly began repeating small fragments of them during their previously silent evening meals. Brooke would happily chatter over her untouched vegetables, dropping casual phrases like how Sarah believed rain was wonderful because it washed the tired air completely clean. Brooke also proudly announced that Sarah said a bedroom that feels far too big can actually transform into a wonderful space if you simply learn how to fill it with the right kind of joy. Thomas listened to every single word, without offering any corrections or criticisms, carefully storing each borrowed phrase in his heart, with a strange, fierce protectiveness he could not entirely justify to himself. On a late Friday afternoon, he slowly descended the stairs to the grand main hall, pausing near the grand entranceway for a long moment before finally stepping into the room where Sarah was working. She was facing the opposite wall, methodically organizing her various cleaning supplies into her plastic caddy, completely unaware of his silent approach, until his voice broke the quiet. He spoke softly, suggesting that she did not need to rush to leave at the exact scheduled minute, today offering her the unprecedented permission to finish her tasks at a much more relaxed, comfortable pace. Sarah turned around in sheer surprise, noting that his hands were casually tucked into his pockets, and for the first time since she had arrived, his glowing phone was nowhere in sight. There was a distinctly new softness in his posture, a stark departure from the rigidly tense executive who previously stormed through the corridors without acknowledging the humanity of his staff. She responded firmly, carefully balancing politeness with her established boundaries, stating that she always completed her assigned work exactly on time, refusing to accept any special treatment that might blur the professional lines. He offered a remarkably small, almost entirely imperceptible smile, the very first genuine expression of warmth she had ever witnessed, crossing his usually stoic, handsome features. He gently clarified that he fully recognized her efficiency. He was merely suggesting that she did not need to push herself to the point of absolute exhaustion on his account. She nodded briefly in acknowledgement, watching closely as he quietly turned and exited the grand hall, leaving her standing entirely alone with a damp yellow flannel clutched tightly in her hand. Her mind immediately warned her that whenever a powerful, wealthy man suddenly begins paying attention to the cleaning staff, he invariably wants something, and she had neither the precious time nor the emotional energy to play those games. However, as she sat on the bumping, crowded city bus, later that dark evening, staring blankly at the blurry streetlights flashing past the smeared window, her thoughts kept drifting dangerously. She found herself recalling the unexpected softness of that tiny, fleeting smile far more times than she had originally intended or strictly allowed herself to do. The very next week, a momentous event occurred. Brooke finally laughed out loud in Sarah's presence, an event triggered by something as incredibly foolish as a soapy yellow sponge loudly slapping against the wet marble floor. The joyful sound was incredibly brief, a beautiful smile that vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, but it was undeniably real, and Sarah witnessed the miracle firsthand. She purposefully made absolutely no fuss over the precious moment, refusing to draw any unnecessary attention to the fragile joy, and simply continued her scrubbing with a remarkably lighter heart. There was an undeniable magic in that fleeting child's smile that felt like a massive, monumental victory, one she had never intentionally plotted to achieve, but which meant the world to her. Thomas had witnessed the miracle too, standing frozen in the deep shadows near the massive stone fireplace at the far end of the sprawling reception hall. When Brooke's face finally returned to its usual seriousness, Thomas locked eyes with Sarah across the vast room, his expression radiating a profound, absolute gratitude that required absolutely no spoken words to be perfectly understood. That look of pure, unadulterated gratitude completely unsettled Sarah, causing her to quickly lower her gaze and swiftly carry her cleaning supplies into the adjacent dining room to escape the intensity. It was the specific kind of profound thankfulness that demands absolutely nothing in return, the raw emotion of a desperate parent who had finally witnessed a sliver of light in a long, dark tunnel. She desperately needed a few quiet moments to process the complicated emotions rapidly churning within her own chest, because she acutely knew this was no longer just professional sympathy for a sad child. Refusing to admit the growing connection she felt toward the father was becoming an exhausting internal battle, one she was not entirely ready to confront while wearing her work apron. 2 days after the sponge incident, Thomas unexpectedly appeared in the massive gourmet kitchen very early in the morning, long before the strict housekeeper Nancy had even arrived to unlock the pantry. Sarah was quietly hanging her thin coat on the back peg and organizing her cleaning caddy when he gently slid a steaming porcelain cup of rich coffee across the marble island toward her. He casually asked if she drank coffee, completely ignoring the massive breach of traditional employer boundaries while she stared cautiously at the expensive cup and then slowly up at his waiting face. She cautiously confirmed that she did, and he smoothly replied that she should take that particular cup, casually lying that he had simply brewed far too much for himself. Both of them knew perfectly well that his casual excuse was an absolute fabrication. But Sarah accepted the warm cup anyway, knowing that refusing it would create an awkward scene over something entirely unnamed. She stood near the sink, slowly sipping the rich dark brew, while he remained casually leaning against the opposite side of the broad marble counter, separated by the polished stone. For roughly 4 long minutes they existed in a remarkably comfortable silence, listening to the heavy coastal rain violently lashing against the massive kitchen windows, allowing the rhythmic sound to safely fill the empty space. He was the one who finally broke the quiet atmosphere, softly asking exactly how many years she had been making a living by cleaning other people's houses. She took a slow sip and honestly replied that it had been roughly 8 years, confirming his subsequent question that she had spent almost all of those years working inside private family residences. She briefly mentioned a short, deeply unpleasant stint working for a massive commercial cleaning company, explaining that she strongly disliked the sterile, soulless nature of scrubbing empty corporate office buildings. When he softly asked why she preferred houses, she swallowed the last drop of coffee and eloquently explained that in a corporate office, you simply scrub an empty space, but in a family home, you carefully clean a living history. Thomas remained perfectly quiet for a long moment, staring thoughtfully into the dark depths of his own ceramic mug, before quietly agreeing that her observation was profoundly true. Sarah deliberately rinsed her cup in the deep brass sink, offered a brief, polite word of thanks, without any unnecessary ceremony, and immediately reached for her yellow rubber gloves. She desperately needed to maintain the clear professional boundary, separating the wealthy owner from the hired help, firmly reminding herself that the dust in the library would absolutely not wait for a friendly chat. Yet despite her best efforts at professional distance, she acutely realized that the invisible line between them was growing significantly thinner and much more complicated with every passing morning. In the subsequent days, she caught herself stepping off the noisy bus and walking up the long driveway with thoughts that had absolutely nothing to do with her daily cleaning checklist. She caught herself thinking about the intense, focused way he actually listened to her words, about the unnecessary coffee he brewed, and about that rare, heavy smile that changed the entire landscape of his face. In the final week of March, a truly extraordinary sound echoed through the grand estate. Brooke was actually running wildly down the long, polished marble corridor for the very first time. Sarah heard the rapid, chaotic slapping of tiny feet and spun around just in time to catch the little girl flying toward her with her arms thrown wide open and a massive, brilliant laugh bursting from her chest. That joyous, uncontained laughter completely transformed the child, stripping away the heavy years of sorrow, and finally allowing her to look exactly like the carefree little girl she was always meant to be. Sarah immediately dropped to her knees, opening her arms wide to absorb the small, wonderful impact of the child crashing safely against her chest, feeling her own eyes grow dangerously hot with unshed tears. This profound moment held absolutely no monetary value. It was the rare kind of pure, unscripted magic that happens only once or twice in a lifetime and permanently alters the shape of your heart. Thomas froze near the grand entrance, utterly paralyzed by the breathtaking sight of his beautiful daughter radiating genuine happiness for the first time in 2 agonizing years, completely unsure of how to react. Brooke suddenly spun around, spotted her stunned father standing in the doorway, paused for a brief second of evaluation, and then excitedly asked if Sarah could teach her how to bake a cake today. Thomas immediately shifted his intense gaze to Sarah, his eyes silently pleading for her cooperation, completely discarding any formal rules about the maid's strictly regimented daily duties and scheduled hours. Without a single moment of hesitation, the wealthy executive declared that if Sarah was willing to tackle the messy project, he was entirely on board with the unexpected culinary adventure. Sarah, who had repeatedly sworn to herself that she would maintain strict professional distance, looked at the hopeful child and the desperate father, threw her rigid rules out the window, and warmly agreed. The previously sterile, magazine-perfect kitchen of that massive Southampton mansion had absolutely never experienced the chaotic, joyful noise that erupted over the next 2 beautiful, messy hours. Brooke enthusiastically plunged her tiny hands straight into the sticky batter, wildly tossing white flour across the pristine black marble counters and expensive stainless steel appliances without a single care in the world. Sarah happily allowed the massive mess to happen, knowing fundamentally that any child attempting to bake for the very first time desperately needs the absolute freedom to make mistakes without constant strict corrections. Thomas hovered awkwardly near the swinging pantry door for roughly 10 minutes, watching the chaotic joy unfold before finally stepping entirely into the warm kitchen and fully joining the messy fray. He casually grabbed a floral apron hanging abandoned behind the pantry door and tied it securely around his waist, completely ignoring his incredibly expensive custom-tailored dress shirt. When the little girl suddenly looked up and noticed her serious corporate father wearing a flowery baking apron covered in flour, she released a booming, uncontrollable belly laugh that bounced off the high ceiling. It was a loud, totally uninhibited roar of pure delight, an incredibly raw sound that had absolutely never been rehearsed, and Thomas immediately joined in with a deep, booming laugh of his own. For one beautiful suspended hour, the notoriously cold and echoing gourmet kitchen magically transformed into a genuinely warm heart of a real home occupied by real people, experiencing genuine messy happiness. Sarah quietly stepped back from the island, watching the father and daughter playfully smear frosting, and felt something heavy and profound finally settle deep within her own chest, settling in a way she could no longer deny. The resulting chocolate cake was delightfully lopsided, slightly burnt around the bottom edges, and absolutely the most delicious thing Brooke fiercely declared she had eaten in the past 2 years. She made this grand pronouncement with her mouth completely full of chocolate frosting, while her father solemnly nodded in absolute agreement, refusing to argue with the chef's perfect assessment. When the antique grandfather clock chimed 8 times, signaling it was far past her departure time, Sarah quietly removed her stained apron, gathered her worn bag, and prepared for the long journey back to her apartment. Brooke had already fallen fast asleep on the plush velvet sofa in the adjacent living room, her small face peaceful, and a streak of white flour still stubbornly clinging to her golden hair. Thomas was standing quietly near the towering glass windows, staring out at the dark, crashing ocean, when Sarah silently walked past the grand entranceway, attempting to slip out unnoticed. He turned swiftly, stopped her with a gentle word, and spoke in a remarkably thick, emotional tone that sounded completely different from any voice he had ever used before. He looked directly into her tired eyes and quietly confessed that she had somehow managed to fundamentally change something inside his broken home, an incredible transformation he did not know how to adequately explain. Sarah paused by the heavy oak door, gripping her worn bag with both hands, and met his intense gaze squarely, deeply knowing that such a raw confession demanded absolute, unflinching honesty. She gently shook her head and calmly explained that she was not the magic cure. It was his little girl who had done the hard work, and that she had merely provided a safe, quiet space for trust to grow. Thomas fell entirely silent, staring thoughtfully down at the polished floorboards for a long moment, absorbing the profound humility in her response, before slowly raising his eyes back to meet hers. The man standing before her was no longer the intimidating millionaire employer. He was simply an exhausted father who had carried a crushing burden for entirely too long, and finally realized he did not have to hold it alone. He asked softly if she would definitely return on Tuesday, and she took a deep breath, firmly promised she would, and walked out into the chilly night without looking back. She desperately needed the long bus ride to carefully untangle the massive knot of confusing emotions tightening in her chest, fully realizing she needed to protect her own heart before allowing anything else to happen. On Tuesday morning, Sarah arrived exactly on time, but Nancy intercepted her at the service entrance, wearing an unusually distressed expression, a look completely alien to the housekeeper's normally stoic face. It was not her usual stern mask of authority. It was the troubled, uncertain look of a loyal employee who had received incredibly heavy news and possessed absolutely no idea how to properly handle it. Sarah wisely asked no questions, simply gathering her plastic caddy and heavy mop, and marched directly up the sweeping stairs to begin her routine on the third floor. Brooke was already waiting anxiously in the long hallway, nervously gripping a bright elastic band exactly like she had done weeks before, but this time her reaction was entirely different. The little girl suddenly sprinted down the corridor and crashed into Sarah's legs, wrapping her tiny arms fiercely around the maid's waist and burying her face deep into the smelling fabric of the apron. They stood locked together in the quiet hallway for nearly 30 long seconds, a profoundly silent embrace that communicated far more raw emotion and desperate need than any lengthy conversation ever could. Sarah gently stroked the child's soft hair, patiently, waiting for the frantic grip to loosen intuitively, understanding that the terrified little girl was actively seeking an anchor in a suddenly shifting world. When Brooke finally stepped back and looked up, Sarah immediately recognized the intense, fearful vulnerability swimming in the child's eyes, because she had witnessed that exact same terror in her own daughter's eyes during incredibly dark times. It was the desperate, heartbreaking need to be absolutely certain that the adult standing in front of them was not going to vanish suddenly into thin air. Brooke asked with brutal, unadorned directness if Sarah was going to keep coming back to the house, stripping away any polite filters and demanding an honest, concrete promise from the only safe harbor she knew. Sarah matched the child's intense seriousness, looked her directly in the eye, and firmly promised that as long as there was work for her to do in this massive house, she would absolutely return. It was admittedly not a perfectly permanent guarantee, but it was the most honest, grounded truth Sarah could offer, without creating false, impossible expectations that might later shatter the child's fragile trust. Brooke seemingly accepted the measured answer instinctively, understanding that when a trustworthy adult speaks without sugarcoating reality, the hard truth is far more reliable than a sweet, empty lie. They sat quietly together on the hallway floor to complete the morning braid, and afterward, Brooke peacefully retreated to her large bedroom, while Sarah methodically began scrubbing the dusty baseboards. The morning routine felt entirely normal, yet a heavy, unseen tension hung thick in the air, primarily because Thomas was completely absent from all of his usual predictable spots. Sarah meticulously swept, polished, and mopped her way down through the sprawling second floor, finally arriving in the cavernous main hall shortly before the clock struck noon entirely, without seeing the master of the house. She only consciously realized how deeply she missed his quiet, lingering presence when her shift was nearly complete. An alarming personal revelation that spoke volumes more than she was entirely comfortable admitting to herself. She was kneeling down, packing her damp rags away, when she heard heavy, exhausted footsteps echoing down the corridor, and Thomas slowly entered the grand room. His expensive suit jacket was hanging completely open. His silk tie was pulled loose, and he wore the thoroughly devastated expression of a man who had survived a brutal battle and was still bleeding. Carlos confidently presented the aircraft's electronic logs and GPS records before the shareholders, exposing the corporate deception and proving that the blame placed on veteran pilot Agustin for the fatal stormy night accident was false. As the truth emerged, the board unanimously removed the corrupt executive Hector from all his positions, froze his assets, and turned his case over to the authorities for criminal prosecution. At the same time, legal advisor Mariana Valdez abandoned her loyalty to him and handed over incriminating recordings and emails, while Sofia publicly canceled all contracts with the negligent company and ordered a worldwide recall of the dangerous aircraft parts despite the financial cost. In the months that followed, the company's reputation was restored and justice was finally served. Carlos donated the original Black Phoenix prototype to an aviation museum and sold the 3 secret Viento aircraft for a fair price, giving him the financial freedom he had long deserved. He opened his own successful repair shop. His daughter Paola moved into a peaceful home he had prepared for her, and together they hired investigator Laura Arango to carry out certified inspections, strengthening a lasting partnership built on honesty, courage, and shared hardship. When Sofia returned to reclaim the Silver Hummingbird aircraft, she and Carlos reflected on everything they had accomplished together. They realized that second chances are earned through integrity, and the courage to defend the truth, not through wealth or power. Carlos watched her fly away toward the Sonoran horizon, understanding that an honest person's actions can defeat corruption, restore the honor of the fallen, and leave behind the most valuable legacy of all, a clean name, an honest conscience, and unwavering loyalty to one's principles.